Hello, Kaylo. How are you doing today?
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Can you please introduce yourself and tell our listeners where you are joining us from what part of the world?
So my name is Kaylo Littlejohn. I'm a fourth year PhD student working with Dr. Edward Chang and Gopala Anumanchipalli in the Chang lab at UCSF. And there I work on the Bravo clinical trial, which is code for BCI restoration of arm and voice. So my sort of job or research interests for my thesis involved trying to restore movement and speech communication to people who have lost it due to severe forms of paralysis.
Mhm. Thank you so much for your introduction. And I would like to go a little bit into your past to see how did you come to this stage when you're conducting this amazing research on speech neuroprosthesis. Maybe even when you were growing up, did you know that you will be dealing with the neuroscience, neurotechnologies, or anything like that? So how did all this unravel for you?
So for me, I used to, when I was a kid, I was always interested in math and science. So I guess I had very sort of generic outlook on what I wanted to do. But I always knew I was interested in sort of like STEM, I guess, science and mathematics. Um, and then over time, I sort of got interested sort of organically in the idea of BCI. And something that really impacted me is during my sophomore year, or I guess freshman summer. So the summer before the sophomore year of college, I worked at a summer camp for people who had disabilities and seeing just the devastation that is occurring to folks that have severe paralysis or disorders really sort of made me realize that BCI is not something that's just science fiction. It could actually be used to help people, to help them in some way. So that got me interested in sort of going down the path of more research minded topics and starting to look into different labs and try to learn more about how I can get involved in sort of both the cool, interesting aspect, which is, you're decoding something from the brain, it's never been done, but also the more altruistic aspect, which is actually using these technologies to help people who have disabilities. So that's sort of the outline of how I got involved in this research.
Mhm. And was this time when you already learned about BCIs, was it during your high school years or was it already during college?
So formally learning about BCIs, I guess I would say that was in my freshman year of college. I guess anecdotally, there's always TV shows and sci-fi and so forth. So we hear about that, and okay, maybe someday deep in the future we'll all have like these sort of implants. I've always seen those kinds of movies, but actually translating that into an actual viable research path, that kind of came to me my freshman year.
Thank you. And some people who are just graduating from the high school, um, not all of them have very clear understanding what they want to study, what they want to do. You also mentioned that you knew a broad aspect of what you want to do. Yes, STEM in general. When did it become clear to you what exactly you want to do? Is it engineering? Is it biology, biomedical sciences? What is it? When did it come, and what helped you to really create this clear path?
For me, it was a lot of trial and error. Um, or I wouldn't say error, but I would say exploration and finding out which path suits me best. Like, for example, I went to three different colleges in undergrad, and I also was swapping around so many majors during my freshman year. And I think that was worth it because just exploring and trying out all these different pathways lets you get a sense of what you like and what you enjoy. And I think that's totally normal for anyone that is in that situation. They're not sure what they want to do. And I think for me, it there was never really like this one moment where I knew, okay, because of this one experience, this is the path I'm going to follow. It's always sort of arose and sort of organically, but through a lot of trial and exploration. So a lot of trying something, realizing, I'm not really interested in that. Trying another thing, realizing, oh, I actually find some interest. And it's just this very slow process that sort of evolved over the course of like on the order of 6 to 8 years.
Mhm. Maybe you can provide just some specifics as an example for people who are in similar situations because they really need support and some example of how it happens. Yes. So, what did you try? What majors did you try? You said you swapped several of them.
One thing that I did, which was very helpful for me, was during my early college years, I would try and read up as much as I can on various professors. And then I would reach out to them and try to understand more about their research and what I could do to potentially contribute. Just reaching out early in the process, not in a way where you're kind of just grasping at straws. Like I would try to read on their literature and see how I might be able to contribute, and also talking to their graduate students and doing that many, many times, not being afraid to just put yourself out there and learn from these various professors and graduate students. And I actually did the same thing when I moved to grad or transitioned to graduate study. I wasn't sure which lab I wanted to be in. So I reached out to many professors. I sat in on many different lab meetings. And through that process, it can be a little awkward because, you're meeting these people that you don't really know, and you don't want to feel like you're just there to take value. You also want to give value. But I felt that, for me, that was really important to make sure that I'm choosing something that I want to do, because this is like, you only get one shot at life. So don't want to spend a whole undergraduate career or a whole PhD doing something you don't like. So doing that exploration, reaching out to many people is an example of something that helped me kind of figure out what's out there. And then from there, what kind of opportunities are available at my university, and then selecting from there the best one that seems to match what I'm interested in doing.
Yeah. Thank you. So, what was your final major from your undergraduate studies that you received?
So I received a degree in electrical engineering from Columbia University.
Mhm. And then, where did you go to study for your graduate program?
So right now I'm in the Berkeley PhD program for electrical engineering and computer sciences. At the time, I really wanted to go to the Stanford program for EE to work on the BrainGate clinical trial, but I did not get into Stanford. But luckily, I was able to work with Dr. Eddie Chang, who's another great BCI pioneer, and I was fortunate to get into Berkeley, and then from there, I was able to explore different labs and learn more about the Chang lab. Yeah, so that's sort of my process from undergrad to graduate school.
Mhm. Very good. And what skills do you think helped you to get to this lab and start working on speech neuroprosthesis and work with Dr. Chang? What do you think helped you with that?
I kind of like to think of it in terms of two tiers. One is sort of the baseline that everyone sort of knows about, which is try to get the best grades you possibly can, try to get as much research experience as you can, try to learn something unique. Like, for example, maybe you can be very good with computer science, or maybe you're good on the neuroscience aspect of things. And I think those sorts of things, most people are aware that they should try to get good grades and so forth. So that definitely helped. But then on this other tier, I would say are things that are more subtle. And I would say in that category would be things like having a high sense of agency and independence. So being able to learn things on your own, knowing when to reach out for help, and when to try to figure out things on your own. And then also just being a very like self-motivated person, like trying to read about the literature, um, and really trying to learn. Like you need to have some self-initiative to like learn a lot of things that could be of value to the research group, beyond just the baseline requirements to gain entry to the program. And I think that is what really helps to separate some students that want to join from many applicants who have potentially the same stats. Yeah, that's just my opinion, but others may have like a different view.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm just curious, how do you think it's possible to demonstrate that self motivation, independence to stand out? Because many people are actually reaching out and asking how to stand out. Yes, so you touched upon a very important question, but how to do it? Yes, how to demonstrate.
Knowing the literature really helps a lot. Like knowing what the research lab has done and having some ideas about what you might want to do in the lab is also really important. Like, I'll just use our lab as an example, but you could take this for any lab. We work on speech BCIs, um, as one of the aspects of our lab. And if somebody wanted to join and say they want to work on speech BCI, it helps for them to like have maybe some idea of potential projects that they might want to work on when they want to do speech BCI, I guess, in the lab. And just having some sense of like just building up context for what the lab is doing is important. And I think for any lab, the expectation is not that you're at the expert level at the same person that's already in the group, but just having a baseline understanding, it's helpful. It's helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now you came to this BCI lab, started working on speech BCI project. Um, can you introduce GBCIs to our listeners? What are GBCIs? Just if somebody new to this area is good.
A speech BCI, or another word for it, some people refer to it as a speech neuroprosthesis, is a brain computer interface which decodes speech from some human cortex and basically translates the neural activity into what the person is trying to say. And this is predominantly in the application of restoring speech to people who have lost it. So, for example, someone may have a stroke, which leaves them with no ability to articulate or speak, and a speech BCI would enable them to speak again by decoding their neural activity into speech. So this speech could take the form of text. It could also take the form of the actual voice itself, the waveform corresponding to what they're saying, and it could also take the form of the articulation or the movements of their jaw and their mouth and vocal tract. So that's what a speech BCI is designed to do, and everything right now is currently at early stage of clinical testing, or sorry, early stage feasibility, which then will be translated into clinical usage later down the line.
Thank you very much for this explanation. And what would be the ideal speech neuroprosthesis? How do you imagine that final ideal device that people would be able to use?
In my mind, I kind of view it as well. There's sort of three things that come to mind. Which one is the stability of the device. So how long does the device or speech BCI work after someone starts using it? So for example, if someone receives a brain implant and then that device stops working after a week, that would be poor stability compared to another device which can work for 5 years or 10 years. So ideally, speech neuroprostheses should work over the course of decades. Um, that way, one does not need to have multiple brain surgeries. One can have a single brain surgery, or ideally no brain surgery, and that device can remain stable over time. The second would be accuracy. So if one can decode speech on an open vocabulary, meaning anything the person wants to say, the speech can be accurately decoded with uh, very high accuracy, like say 97 or 98%, that would offer more utility than another speech neuroprosthesis, which may have a restricted vocabulary, say only 50 words or 100 words, and potentially even lower accuracy. So the one with high accuracy would be better. So that's the second thing. And the third one would be the invasiveness. So ideally, one should have no brain surgery. And that would mean that the person would likely have to use a non-invasive BCI, so something that does not involve a neurosurgery. That would be the ideal case. Next to that, you would have things like ECOG, where you have a neurosurgery, but the electrodes are placed on the surface of the cortex. They are not actually penetrating into the brain. And then the most invasive form would be something like a microelectrode array, where the brain is actually being penetrated. So so unfortunately, right now, the spatial temporal resolution, or basically the how detailed of a view we can get into the neural signal, is limited with a non-invasive approach. So currently, the most viable speech neuroprostheses, that the ones that get the most accuracy and have the most stability, are invasive approaches. But hopefully in the future we'll have non-invasive approaches that could work well.
Thank you so much. And you already mentioned that your lab, the lab where you work, is known for developing speech neuroprosthesis, and there were already quite a few studies that received BCI Award. The one that current study also received in 2023. So maybe you can elaborate on what steps has your team already accomplished towards developing this ideal neuroprosthesis that you just talked about.
The literature stems back a long time, all the way to like the early 1900s, where people were doing the first neurosurgeries and people to understand what parts of brain correspond to different functions like speech or movement, etc. But a lot of the progress has come in the last 1 to 2 decades, where um, we can have access to patients that are in the hospital for epilepsy, and we implant them with ECOG. It's a recording device it's sort of like EEG, but in invasive form. And these electrodes are placed over the part of a brain of somebody who uh, has seizures, and the idea is to monitor them for seizures. But in the meantime, we can actually do basic science experiments to understand the neural basis for speech production and perception. And it's from that sort of methodology that a lot of our labs' speech findings have initially came from. So basically, um, understanding like how that the brain actually encodes the movements of the vocal tract. So the tongue moving, the jaw moving, the lips moving, etc. That was shown in our group to be encoded by the signals captured using ECOG. And based on these studies, which were very promising, we decided to essentially see, can we use those signals to actually decode speech? Because if we could decode the speech, then potentially that could help people who have paralysis. So in 2019, there was a paper by my advisor Gopala Anumanchipalli, which showed that one can actually directly synthesize speech from the brain of people who are able-bodied. So these are still the EMU participants. And that really motivated us to start the Bravo clinical trial, the BCI restoration of arm and voice, where um, it's great that we can decode speech from people who are healthy, but what about people who actually could benefit from a device that could decode their speech? So in this trial, one of the papers, which is the most recent one, is our 2023 paper, a high performance neuroprosthesis for speech decoding and avatar control, which was the subject or the winner of the 2023, second place winner of the 2023 BCI Award. And there we implanted a woman who had severe paralysis and anarthria due to stroke. And we implanted this ECOG grid, 253 channels, over the part of her brain that corresponds to the speech production. So normally those signals would go down into the vocal tract, but unfortunately, due to the injury, that's not possible. So we essentially built a neuroprosthesis to decode both the text, speech, and also the articulation to drive an avatar. That's probably the closest we've gotten to something that could be clinically viable, but there still remains a lot to be done. And I'm happy to go into the details of that study as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, it would be very interesting to go into the details, and especially the details that separate this particular study from other studies. Yes, and avatar control, I think, was the highlight of this specific study. So, what was new and different in this study that has never been done before?
So this study was published at the same time as another study from Stanford University, where we used very similar. So both represented a landmark advance forward. So previous approaches to decoding speech relied on very small vocabularies. So the person would only be able to use the device to speak, say, 50 words. And that's quite limiting because there's only so many sentences one can compose from 50 words. And so previous studies were very much proof of principle showing that it's possible to decode some speech from the brain of someone who has paralysis. What separates this study from that is the vocabulary size is much larger. So in our study, we used 1,000+ word vocabulary, which covers around 86 to 90% of the English language. And we were able to decode the text with around a 25% word error rate. So that's 1 in 4 words wrong. It's still not perfect, but with this level of vocabulary, it's much better than what was previously demonstrated. And how this was done is we essentially used the same AI model that is used for speech recognition on a cell phone. So whenever you speak into Siri or you speak into Alexa, the same type of algorithm was used for our study, but instead of using the speech as the training waveform, or sorry, as the training input, we use the brain as the input. So the brain neural signals, we pass that through the same type of model, and that was able to, and we trained our model to essentially predict the text as accurately as possible. And that's what allowed us to create this much better performing speech neuroprosthesis. But we didn't want to just do the text because text is great, but it's somewhat unnatural in the sense that what we really want to do is restore a person's voice, like how they actually would sound had they not had paralysis. So to do that, we took the same type of algorithm, but instead of predicting the text or the phonemes, phonemes are the units that represent text. We instead predicted acoustic units that represent the speech. So we went from brain to acoustic unit, and that acoustic unit was transformed into a waveform. And that waveform was conditioned on a wedding video. So fortunately, our participant had a wedding video from her many years ago before she had paralysis. And we were able to use that in combination with her brain signal to reconstruct her voice, how she would have sounded had she not had paralysis. So the decoding of speech directly was one thing that really separated this from previous works, because previously it was not clear if one could decode actual speech from someone who had paralysis. And then the third thing that we tried to do was, okay, it's great that we can decode the text and the speech, but what if we can actually try to embody the person? Meaning, could we decode the articulation, the movements of the person's face and or vocal tract, and use that to drive an avatar, a high fidelity representation of what the person would have looked like had they not had paralysis. So our participant selected her customized avatar, and we were able to decode the movements of this avatar face from her brain and use that to drive the avatar. So we worked with a company, Speech Graphics, that helped us do this animation. And together with them, we were able to decode the avatar face of the person as well.
Thank you so much. The next question is, what were the biggest methodological advances that helped you to create this new project?
In terms of methodology, so there's kind of two ways of looking at it. Uh, One is the algorithm itself. So the algorithm is designed in a way such that it doesn't require alignment to the person's behavior. So what I mean by that is when someone who is healthy speaks, and when we record their neural activity, we know exactly what they're actually trying to say because we have their speech. They're actually speaking, so we know what they're trying to say at every time point. But for someone who has paralysis, we don't know when they're trying to actually speak because we can't hear what they're saying because they have paralysis. So to circumvent that, we use something called connectionist temporal classification, CTC loss, and that's what's used in automatic speech recognition for cell phones, and we use that algorithm because it does not require there to be alignment between when the brain signal and what the person is actually trying to say. So, um, overcoming that alignment problem was the key algorithmic advance. And then the recording the recording advance would be increasing the density of the grid. So this grid had about twice as many electrodes as previously implanted ECOG clinical trial participants. And they were a little bit more dense. So they were closer together on the cortex. And that denser sampling lets us get more fine-grained spatial information. And that having that good source of data is really critical. We can't do it without the better data, the better recording device. So those two things are what made it possible. And then the outputs are just the text, the speech, the avatar, but those are independent of those two methodological advances. Pardon me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. What was the most challenging part for you in this project?
For us, the challenging part was our participant was going home for Christmas. So we had a very tight deadline for which to record demonstration videos. So knowing that we only have like one or two sessions left before she leaves to go for the holidays, that was probably the toughest challenge because we had to do a lot of infrastructure development in a short period of time. And with uncertainty, because we don't know how good the performance will be. So working within those deadlines was probably the most stressful part, because if we don't have a demo, then the paper is harder to publish. So getting that first demo video was the most challenging part. And then I would also say maybe down the line, we also collected a demo where we did all three simultaneously. We decoded the text, the speech, and the avatar at the same time. So our early demos were just doing the speech or just doing the avatar or just doing the text, but then combine them all into one functional system. That was also a challenging part.
And what helped you to solve that challenge, especially the second one that was challenging from the computational probably perspective? Yes, combining it all together and making it all work. But how did you solve it?
That was a lot of kind of mundane software engineering work. So there was no like intellectual contribution there. Because we already had the independent modalities working. I think it was just, okay, how fast can we code up the new infrastructure to do all three at the same time? What helped us there, I would just say persistence in making sure that the system can work, testing it offline first before, because the participants only have so much time. So we want to make sure everything works before we actually record. So really being persistent and making sure everything is ready to go before the session. That way you're not in the session scrambling, trying to figure out the person is connected and so forth. We don't want that. So really persisting and making sure everything is ready before the session starts, that really helps.
Thank you. And of course, in every project, we have certain expectations of how everything will go. Yes, my question is, what was the most unexpected thing that you didn't expect when you started the study?
I think we were surprised how fast the performance increased. When we first started with B3, that's her code name in the study. So we got very fast, high accuracy performance with what's called NATO code words. So NATO is kind of like the alphabet system, but for military. So saying like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, we can have the participants say those words and then we can classify between them. And that can be used to drive a spelling device to spell out characters, but using speech. And we were almost within a few sessions already getting like close to 100% accuracy. And also, we tried decoding with a restricted vocabulary. Say, I think we tried like on the order of 170 words. I'm blanked on the exact number, but smaller vocabulary, and we saw very fast performance increase with that. So that was the most unexpected, and made us realize, hey, we should probably try to shoot for something more general purpose, like large vocabulary decoding.
Thank you. And what skills helped you to make this project successful? You personally in the work that you were doing on this project.
So everyone has their own skill set, and with something like this, we have to have everyone, basically from the neurosurgeon all the way to clinician, all the way to like machine learning expertise. So for me, doing my job well, which is um, really being able to to train the machine learning models and accurately characterize them and make sure everything is sanity checked, and also build out the software engineering components that allow for the speech and avatar decoding. That was probably the most useful skill set. So a lot of machine learning and software engineering skills, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And what technological advancements that are happening right now inspired you or maybe contributed, yes, to the success of this?
Definitely the AI models. Those had a huge influence, because without those AI techniques, we couldn't have done anything that we were trying to do, because doing linear models aren't very accurate when you're trying to scale to like large vocabularies. So a linear model might be able to classify between 50 sentences or so. But if you try to do a very large vocabulary, you need something that's more complex than that. And the AI revolution is what allows us to actually take advantage of the data and use it in a way to we can use the AI in a way to actually contribute to the decoding.
Mhm. Thank you. And are there any research projects or technological developments in general, maybe some researchers worldwide that actually inspire you in your work?
There's so many, it's hard to really say. I think the Brain Gate comes to mind because they were really the first ones to try to build BCIs, or one of the first ones. I shouldn't say they're the first, but um, they're the largest clinical trial with people having implantable arrays, and they had a lot of success with motor BCI, like cursor control, and trying to build BCIs that can control robotic arms and so forth. That's pretty inspiring to see that it seems like the participants are getting value and they want to be part of these trials to help other folks in their situation. So that's an inspiration. And then I also think there's just so much literature on just basic science of speech production that span over like a century. And I think that can be inspiring because it tells us that the signals are there. Like there are signals that correspond to speech in the brain, and we just need to figure out what's the limit of that, and also if that limit is high enough, how can we actually decode the speech? So I think that was inspirational and kind of starting up the trial. Um, Yeah, and there's also another technology, SEEG. There's another lab, Christian Herf. So Christian Herf developed, he had a paper called Brain to Text, which to my knowledge is the first demonstration of um, high performance text decoding from the brain. So that was also a really Christian Herf is a very inspiring researcher to us.
Thank you so much. And the question that always pops up when we talk about neuroprosthesis and speech neuroprosthesis is the stability of the signal and its decoding over time. I know that, like you also mentioned at the beginning, that there are different ways to record the signal. Some people prefer doing it with the penetrating electrodes. Some, like your group, with equal electrodes. What is the reason for choosing one or another one, and how that stability might change depending on what type of electrodes we're using?
There's a lot that is still unknown. So we know that the ECOG tends to be, so I guess like we can separate into ECOG or intracranial electrodes and MEAs, penetrating electrodes. Um, we know the ECOG is pretty stable over time on the order of 5, 10 years. I think even up to 13 years in some animal models. And that's actually the purpose of our trial. The primary purpose of our trial is actually to evaluate the long-term safety of ECOG. And then we also want to assess the signal, how stable it is over time. With ECOG, you can get encapsulation around the grid, which can attenuate or reduce slightly the amplitude of the high gamma signal, the signal that is found to be the most relevant for speech decoding, yeah, speech decoding. With the penetrating electrodes, those tend to be more unstable, and that's because around the electrode, uh, where the electrode penetrates, there can be glial scarring, basically an immune response, um, and oftentimes there's a lot of variability between the participants, but oftentimes that can result in a very steep drop off in performance. But some participants, like for example, T5 from BrainGate trial, that participant is still getting very high performance all these years later, many years after implant. So if there seems to be some variability between the participants. So in terms of which one to choose, we really don't know. I think in the future, um, probably not. ECOG and Utah or MEA probably won't be used. I think it will probably be something like, this is just my opinion. Maybe it could be a, a upgraded version of ECOG where you have very, very high density, many channels. So imagine an ECOG grid, but having a very high density. That could be one example. Also, there's the Neuralink, which um, they actually have a method for trying to avoid some of so Neuralink's device is similar to a microelectrode array, but they actually have the ability to kind of visualize the blood vessels in the brain, and then they actually try to avoid the blood vessels. That way, they can potentially have less of an immune response and potentially get the stability higher. So something like a Neuralink type of device, or some of the devices that are coming out from various companies, those types of devices seem like those probably would be more promising than an ECOG or a microelectrode array. So is this a good answer? I hope so.
Yes, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you. And my next question is about the participant, because this is for whom we are doing all the studies in general. Yes, that's the goal, to help them. What was an experience of your participant? How did she feel during the process? What was your reaction when she was able to communicate and saw her own avatar with the voice that she actually had was similar to the one that she had before? So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that human side.
The way I would describe it is seem like very emotional experience. I don't want to speak like for her, but from what I observed, it seemed very positive experience. She was super happy and excited to hear her own voice. I mean, keep in mind, this is the first time hearing her own voice in 18 years. So she's never heard her own voice. And thanks to a lot of the modern AI developments, now we can actually get very high fidelity reconstructions of people's voices with minimal training data. So that means that just the wedding video is enough to make a voice sound really like her. So very impactful. And she was also able to have a small conversation with her husband for the first time in many years. And keep in mind that currently to have, say, just a back and forth dialogue of 3 to 4 sentences, that would take 5 to 10 minutes using her current assistive communication device. But using this, we can speed it up tremendously. So specifically, her current device, which is um, it, it it would be around 14 words per minute, whereas using the BCI, she could get up to 78 words per minute. So having that speed is very useful. Now, the accuracy is not there to the point where she can just use this day to day, like, okay, good to go, because it's still 25% word error rate. Um, but it is good enough to be a very promising proof of principle that, okay, high accuracy speech decoding from the brain is possible. And other groups have continued to optimize on this. And I think really promising. I think she felt very happy to be a part of that first proof of principle that speech decoding could be done from the brain. And I think that means a lot to her because like it's a contribution to science, and it wouldn't have been done without her dedication to the trial.
Thank you so much. And we talked about challenges that you experienced as a group in this study. What do you think were the biggest challenges for the participant in the study?
So this one I think has a super clear answer, which is the amount of training data required to train these models. For this study, it takes around 2 weeks of her practicing in order to use the device. So having that long period of calibration or model, or basically data collection in order to get a functional system, That's the biggest challenge because that's a lot of hours one needs to spend speaking. Now, fortunately, because we're dealing with ECOG, it does seem to be stable. So it seems that performance doesn't just immediately drop off. But it's still ideally performance could converge faster. So we think that with better, as we increase the density of the ECOG, that we should be able to get better performance and we should be able to get that performance faster.
Thank you so much. The next question is maybe you can summarize the main results of this study.
So the main results are fast, accurate text decoding from a large vocabulary, 1,000 word vocabulary, um, from someone who has paralysis, decoding of personalized, intelligible speech from the brain. So there have been like a lot of the studies in the past, till this day, even in people who did not have paralysis, the actual reconstructed waveforms were not very intelligible. Maybe a few examples could be chosen, and that through picking of the best ones, you can get a good demo, but no one actually quantified word error rate with speech synthesis. So decoding of personalized intelligible speech synthesis would be the second contribution. And then the third contribution would be the decoding of a live high fidelity avatar. So being able to decode actual face movements. And one thing I didn't mention is we also showed that we could decode actual facial expressions from her. So if she tried to smile or frown, or if she tried to move her lips in various ways, we could decode those movements and doing that. And so this is a general purpose avatar, not just for speech, but also for non-speech as well.
Yes, thank you, Kaylo. And my next question is if you remember at the beginning, we talked about that ideal speech neuroprosthesis. Yes. So, what would it take to get there from your current study? So, what would be the next step to achieve that ultimate goal of that ideal speech neuroprosthesis?
So we have those three things that I had mentioned. I had mentioned the stability, the accuracy, and then also the non-invasiveness. So the part where it's probably lagging the most is probably accuracy. So we know we have the stability with the ECOG, but the accuracy we need to improve. So it's not good enough to have 1 in 4 words wrong. If you spoke into your phone and 1 in 4 words was wrong, you would never use the thing. So ideally, we need to have like very high performance, like 98% or 96%, something on par with what you would get from your cell phone. So for this particular device, ECOG, the challenge is to get higher performance. And to do that, we hypothesize that if you increase the number of channels, eventually we will get there. And it seems to be the case every time the number of channels has been doubled from 64 to 128 to 253. We've gotten great leaps in performance. So we think that as we go to 512, 1024 channels, that will increase the performance further, but it remains to be seen. We need to actually prove. So that's where I think this system could begin to be actually translatable into something that's clinically viable.
Yeah. How long do you think it might take? Of course, I'm not asking for just the exact number of years, but in general, um, how many years would it might take to get to that point, ideal, speech neuroprosthesis?
So in general, there's a promising new preprint that I believe is almost certainly going to be published, which is by Sergey Stavitsy's group at UC Davis, and they actually won the first place BCI Award. And what they showed was they could get very, very high performance. They could get 97% accuracy on open vocabulary speech decoding. And it seems to be stable over the course of 8 months. So I think that is probably the closest to clinically viable. Um, but we need to make sure the important thing is that that kind of array can work for multiple participants, because depending on depending on how it penetrates and where it penetrates, like if it's hitting blood vessels or not, that can where it's penetrating could potentially have an impact on the amount of glial scarring and neuronal loss. So I think that that's probably the closest. But then, so in general, I think within 10 years, for sure, people are going to be able to have speech neuroprostheses. So I think that there are a lot of devices out there that are kind of like the one used in Sergei Savitsky's study, but much better, or presumably, but it seems to be like they might be much better. So, for example, the Neuralink device or the Paradromics, different other kinds of recording devices, those ones, which are kind of like upgraded, they have the benefits of the ECOG, the microelectrode array, and something like a neuropixels where you get depth-wise. Something like that is probably going to be what will actually be the most stable, most accurate, and but not the least invasive though. So I think within 10 years, people are going to be there's going to be some kind of speech neuroprosthesis available for people who have paralysis. I don't know this, but similar to how people can have uh, RNS for deep brain stimulation, and now that can be realized with actual patients, I think that a similar thing will happen with speech neuroprosthesis. For ECOG, we need to see what happens as we increase the density. So I personally think that accuracy will certainly keep improving, but we need to know where that cutoff is. So, like, at what point is just having the electrodes on the surface of the brain? Um, at what point is that not enough? So, one hypothesis is that you can actually get full speech decoding, like very high accurate speech decoding with high density ECOG. And if that's the case, it should be quite stable over time. So it kind of remains to be seen with ECOG, but I think ECOG will probably get there, but I don't know which device will actually be like sort of like one that most participants use. I really don't. I would tell you if I had an opinion, but we should know within like 5 or so years. I think we'll know more.
Before, probably in the past, there were quite only single studies, yes, on developing speech neuroprosthesis. And now we see a boom. Yes, people from different labs are working on this, trying to decode speech. What do you think is the reason for that? Are there any technological developments that made it possible, or what facilitated this a new explosion in the work of speech neuroprosthesis?
Honestly, I think my advisor, Dr. Edward Chang, had a really big role in popularizing this field, just because I won't like name specific names, but there are people that didn't think it was possible that speech could be decoded. You know, they thought, well, we're working with just cursor control with motor BCI. There's no way that why would one stake their lab on speech? That seems really hard to do. But I think a lot of Eddie's work in using the EMU participants to study speech, I think that had a really big impact on, because once people saw that, oh, actually these signals are there and we can see them with high resolution, I think that's what piqued people's attention quite a lot and made them take the speech as an actual, not just something far off, but something that could actually be done. Um, so I would have to yeah, I think Eddie was very instrumental in that. And now, of course, there's other labs as well. Um, yeah, there are many groups, but maybe one could attribute it to epilepsy monitored studies of basic speech production in the epilepsy monitoring unit, like that general category was probably my opinion, the biggest boost to it. And that happened in between 2008 and 2020, ongoing.
Thank you very much. And my next question is about the way that you record signal and then decode. You already mentioned that you are using the signal from motor cortex. You are recording signal from those areas that are responsible for vocal cords, yes, for initiation of the speech production. And I know that there are slightly different approaches that are trying to look at the meaning of the words and recording from the areas of the brain that can provide us with the semantics of speech. Um, Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that difference for our listeners. And the next question would be, is it or do you think it might be beneficial to combine those two approaches? And if you are considering anything like that, or you still think that those are two separate things that should not be merged together, at least at this point?
And it's a tricky one to answer, is because when one is trying to speak, they do have to take the semantics of what they're thinking. Say, I'm looking at a water bottle. I know the meaning of what the water bottle is, but then when I speak it, I actually have to make the muscle movements. So I think that right now, just decoding the articulation, the movements of the mouth is probably well, we know that that is the biggest contributor to current speech BCIs. And I think for now, um, it's predominantly going to be based off the articulatory signal. Um, but to be honest, I don't know. I actually don't know. I think we should study it. We should study that interaction. And there's many works going on to understand the role of planning. How does one plan what they're trying to say? Um, and how does the planning part of the brain go from the semantic concept into the motor map that actually drives the neuroprosthesis? That's ongoing area of research. So I wouldn't view them as explicitly separate. Um, I think it's all in trying to understand, because we can't separate the speech production from the cognitive um, aspects of trying to, like, what we're actually trying to do. But yeah, I actually never thought of that question, so I'll have to think about it some more. But yeah, I would not draw any clear distinction. But I would say current devices decode mostly the motor signal.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. And because you also noted that, first we have that semantic concept of what we want to communicate. Yes, in general, would it mean that the BCI is based on capturing that semantic concept first before even it went to the motor um, control, that those BCIs would be faster in a way because they go to that first stage of just semantic.
Oh, I see. So from that perspective, okay. So the way that you described it is okay. Potentially, what if the BCIs could just directly read the semantics? So we think, so from a basic science perspective, it's very interesting to see the interaction between the semantics and the motor planning and the execution. But from a usage perspective, we think that the BCIs should be trained on the attempted articulation. And the reason for that is because we don't want the BCI to pick up on thoughts, like what you're thinking, for example. We would rather, or at least we don't want it to be picking up on things that you are thinking that you do not intend to broadcast, to be specific. So that intentionality is really present in the motor signal, because when one tries to speak, there's a very clear signal that comes from the brain that should invoke the movement of the vocal tract, and that signal is what is being used to decode the speech. So currently, our best method of being able to verify that when the person is trying to speak, it's only being driven by the articulation is from picking up on those motor signals. So for now, maybe one day in the future, there will be a safe way to do it where you could do semantics and it could be safely guarded from not picking up on internal thoughts that aren't meant to be broadcast. But for right now, based on our current understanding, the best way to do this would be the articulatory to pick up on the motors, the execution signal. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, actually, it does. It does. And it brings me to another question that people often ask in the community in general. Is it possible to read human thoughts? Yes, can BCIs read human thoughts and translate them to somebody? So basically, people are concerned with the privacy. Yes, and I think what you just told resonates with that. So maybe you can comment.
I mean, I think it is valid concern. We don't want to pick up on thoughts that aren't meant to be communicated. So I think that we have methods that can safeguard against that. And when one is just thinking, it doesn't create the same strength of the motor signal as if someone is trying to speak. So the BCIs, like, so for example, we can actually test this by just having the person sit there and think to themselves different stories, different things that they want to do, imagine themselves giving a speech and so forth. And what we see, this is not published data yet, but is that essentially there's no influence on the decoding. So just thinking is not enough. It really depends on the actual attempted muscle movements. Um, so there was a recent paper by Sarah Wandelt. Um, I blanking on the journal name. I think it's Nature Human Behavior, but I'm actually not sure. But it's one of the Nature journals. But they showed some above chance classification accuracy on internal speech. So just having people think about words, can you classify what that word is? So it seems that you can get from that study get above chance decoding performance. So that means that what we need to do is we need to build in safeguards. So build in features into the model which make absolutely sure that it only decodes the speech if it detects a motor signal, a signal directly corresponding to the speech. So we think it's probably unlikely that even if we tried, we don't think we could decode the internal speech, but at least not with open vocabulary or like good accuracy. But we do need to take those precautions. So that's like ongoing area of research.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now I would like to get back to you and your career because we speak about careers. And what do you think are possibilities for the future career development of a professional like you working with neuroprosthesis? What are possible areas of implementation of your knowledge, your experience as you graduate and uh, ready to make new steps in your career?
Yeah, so there's sort of what I would do and then also like what is possible.
Mhm.
So what's possible, at least for someone who's in my position where I have the AI training background, but also the BCI, I think at least the way that I've been thinking about it is there's industry, which would be something like Neuralink, Paradromic, Synchron, different companies that work with BCI decoding devices and trying to build them. And then there's academia, so that would be likely postdoc, and then try to become professor. And then there is industry unrelated to BCI, so or not unrelated, but somewhat orthogonal. So an example of this would be would be the Meta, the Meta VR control labs. That would be an example of a lab that does or a group that does like a non-invasive approach, like for example EMG, risk monitoring, and so forth. So those are sort of three trajectories for me personally. I'm probably going to do a postdoc. So I think that's where I would like to go. Try to go for faculty, but I'm still not sure. I'm still thinking about it. Um, because they're all good options. To me, I actually probably would not go to the industry just because, or sorry, the BCI industry, because I think that it's really hard business model for specifically for invasive approaches, because the amount of overhead, the price per unit to have an invasive BCI is so high that it's very hard to have a good business model. The money is not as good. But you could have potential good impact on the participant. But this has actually happened with prostheses for retina, where they have working systems, but then because the funding model is not good, some of those participants actually can't still get support for their devices. So we would not want to be in that situation. So I think the funding model for the invasive approach, not invasive, if it gets better resolution could be different, but for invasive, I think it's probably for me, I would rather spend my time in academia and then industries. But is that a good answer?
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And you also mentioned that you also might suggest something in general, but other ways, not specifically maybe for you, but what do you see is available for other people who are thinking about their future careers?
Oh, actually, I meant the BCI industry could be one to join it for other, to just not for me, uh,
Yes.
just based
Mhm.
on the outlook of like the approaches that have the best accuracy seem to be. I mean, well, but there are some companies that are interesting. Like Synchron is an example. Synchron is a company that does. They have this thing called a stentrode, where it's not as invasive. They essentially pipe it through the blood vessel to go up to the brain, and that's how the recording sensors get placed to the brain. So it's less invasive. So there are things out there that are improving and not. But the biggest thing is like, yeah, for that is an option to think about. Doing the BCI industry. But for me, I think I've decided academia is probably better.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Killa. And my next question is for those people who are considering submissions for the BCI Award 2024. What would be your recommendations? How to prepare? Um, and maybe you also can encourage those who are undecisive yet to submit or not to submit. Should they submit? Or
Well, if they're on the fence, then go ahead. I would say just submit and try your best, because um everyone, it's kind of like a runner, right? There's always gonna, if you're running, if your sport is jogging, there's always someone faster, there's always someone slower. It's all it's it's hard to self-judge your own work. It's really hard to judge your own work. So let others be the judge, and then go ahead, because you might have an amazing piece of work, but because you know the details, you might have more criticisms of it because you actually know where it falls and where it doesn't. So I would say if you have any doubt, then go. I would for sure submit, because it's a well established award in BCI. People really respect the award, and even if you're just nominated, it's also very very good. So, and then in terms of how to prepare the submission, my recommendation would be to make the advance very clear to the audience. So it doesn't need to be like made for a completely non-expert reader, but it needs to be clear what you did, and then the extent to of the advance, just like you would, just for like the same that you would do for say like a SFN submission, or a co-sign submission or a conference paper submission. Maybe not paper, but abstract, something similar to that, and then have a good demo video. It helps if you have real-time demo videos. That's really compelling because it really helps. We're visual creatures, so I think having a good demo video is also important. Not just for being flashy for no reason, but just to communicate the actual advance, has been done.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And now we're going towards the end of our podcast. And the name in general of our podcast is Neurocareers, making impossible possible. And we have now BCI Award series of that cast. And you mentioned today, actually, that some people thought about speech BCIs as something impossible. Yes, before that work, during Dr. Chang's work that was done. So, what do you think makes the impossible possible? What does it take for people to go against the current opinions of how the things work and get to that stage when what was considered impossible finally maybe in general and maybe for you as well if you get similar situations in your life.
So it's very cliche, but having belief in yourself is important. But also cannot be just blind belief. Like you can't just believe that you are the best and you know everything. I'm not saying that, but just having confidence. And whenever you're trying to solve a very specific problem, sometimes you might actually know more about that problem than anyone else. You don't know more about the whole field than anyone else, but maybe this very specific thing you're trying to solve. So I think this question is sort of uh, can be described in a microcosm, I guess, because in my personal experience, even with this paper, the avatar people gave friendly input, like, oh, that very complicated. Adding this high fidelity avatar, decoding it from the brain, that seems really hard. And people believe in you, but it might have some skepticism due to the engineering. So I think really for me, like just knowing that there was a path forward for this and knowing like basically having studied the problem myself and knowing that it is possible, I think once you know that, then just having the confidence to try to really implement it. And there's some luck involved, like you never know. For example, but you don't know unless you try. So there could be a 50% chance. So everything you do, even if you're confident, you should probably also accept that there will probably be a 30 to 50% chance that it will actually work. But that gives you the confidence because if you make enough of those decisions, then maybe out of 50 decisions, maybe you only hit 20 to 25%. That's still, or 20 to 25 work out. But that if you took none of those decisions, then zero would work out. So I think also knowing there is some risk involved, but just having that in mind helps you to not take every decision. Like if something doesn't work out, don't feel like a personal failure. It's just an opportunity to learn. So that's just my sort of thoughts about it. But yeah, others might have different opinions.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very valuable. And so one question I still wanted to ask is about misconceptions about neurotechnologies. So you worked in this field already for quite some time, and I'm sure you witnessed people saying something, believing something about neurotechnologies that is not true. Um, Maybe you can recall some of those misconceptions, or at least one.
The biggest one is sort of recurring pattern, which is just the idea that this is just a solved field completely. So there's two that I'm thinking of. There's two misconceptions. One is that every demo, by necessity, because you need to do this to advance career and bring in funding. Every demo of course, you want to make your work look as compelling as possible, as fairly as possible. So I think that so many compelling demos are out there. There may be a misconception on how much of this research has been actually translated into a functional neuroprosthesis. So even with the cursor control literature, like those people are not using that day to day, like as in a clinical setting or like as a take home device. Whereas I think the misconception is due to so many like very flashy demos, which I don't fault anyone. I think that is important to show the use case and bring funding and attention to the area, but I think that's probably one misconception that everything has been solved completely. I would also say the other misconception is that every demo is inherently like new and first ever to be done to do this. So the now I'm not attacking this company at all. I like the company a lot, but for example, the Neuralink demo, very impressive, very impressive. But an average person may see Neuralink's demo and think to themselves, oh, this is the first time ever anyone has been decoding anything from the brain. But actually, has been done for almost 20 years now to do cursor control. What's really impressive is that they've done it with a new device that has a very high resolution and so forth. Or even our own study. Someone may see our study and say, this is the first time we've ever decoded anything from the brain for speech. But that's not the case. And previous studies have done it. It's just worse performance, different context. So I think those are the two misconceptions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kyo. It was a great, great pleasure to speak to you and to learn from you. I'm sure our listeners appreciate this discussion very, very much. As we end our podcast, is there anything you would like to share with our listeners? Any advice, any comment, anything you say?
Well, there is the person who's listening who is like a student, and then so, and then the person that might be like a participant, for example. So I think for participants, there are clinical trials out there that ours is one. We're always looking for new participants, but aside just plugging our own trial, I think these devices are coming along quite a ways. I do think there will be solutions available for many people who have paralysis soon. And then for students, yeah, I would just say try to reach out and get involved with different research if you can. Like getting any experience is better than none. So I think if this interests you, then definitely reaching out to different labs that you are interested in. That's a good way to get involved, especially if you're early in the career process. And I also would say I I would not give up on the non-invasive approaches quite yet. Uh I think the current hardware is very limiting in some sense, because they can't get the same resolution as say ECOG or MEA, but I think one day I think there will be advances in the non-invasive world that because if you could get non-invasive technology that works very good, then no one would get a brain surgery to maybe just get a little bit better. So I would not give up on those technologies quite yet.
Thank you so much. And I wish you all possible success and in your project and in your future career development. And I hope that maybe in a few years we can meet again and you will update us on the progress and neuroprosthesis and also on your career. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.